Hey gang, Chase here, and today we'll be touching on 4 things to consider when creating time lapses. The first of which is necessary equipment. First, you're gonna need a camera. Now there are various video cameras out there with time-lapse modes built into them, and you could always just record a standard video frame rate on a video camera and speed it up in post. But for this video, we're gonna use a DSLR, which was easier to handle and still took high quality images in a large resolution. Next, we're gonna need an intervalometer, which is a device that triggers the camera shutter automatically at a chosen interval with precision timing for the duration of the time lapse. Simply set the exposure settings on the camera, set the desired interval on the intervalometer, press start, and you're good to go. Many cameras nowadays actually have intervalometers built into them. A stable base like a tripod is absolutely essential. But if you're feeling adventurous, you can use motorized sliders and heads capable of precisely timed movements to introduce some dynamic action into your time lapses. Another piece of indispensable gear for us was a variable ND like this one. This allowed us to shoot at slower shutter speeds to achieve a pleasing level of motion blur, which we'll go into later. And lastly, we are taking a high-capacity memory card with us, capable of storing the thousands of files needed to create a time-lapse. Time-lapses revolve around shooting intervals, but choosing the right interval can be tricky, so you need to take 2 things into consideration: the final time you want your time-lapse to last and the speed that you want it to play back at. Right now, the video you're watching is playing back at you at 24 frames per second. So if we chose an interval, say 1 shot every second, we'd be compressing 24 seconds of real time into 1 second of playback. Now, if we were to shoot a longer interval, like 1 frame every 5 seconds, we'd end up compressing 2 minutes of time into 1 second of playback. Basically, the longer you space out your shots, the faster your time lapse will appear when playing back, and the faster it will play through a given action. Here's some equations that you can use to help you calculate the right interval for you based on the requirements of your time lapse. Shutter speed is the length of time that your camera shutter stays open for the sensor to capture each frame. Now, the longer shutter speed you have, the more blur any motion within that frame is going to have as well. This effect is called motion blur, and it's something you really have to consider to shoot a time lapse properly. Standard shutter speeds for standard frame rates create a natural looking amount of motion blur. But when you space out your frames and compress them for a time lapse, the motion blur created by standard shutter speeds may not be enough and can give your time lapse a choppy stop motion style look. Increasing the time your shutter is open exposes the sensor to more motion and can create a more natural motion blur in your time lapse. Now generally, you can use a technique called dragging the shutter, which is choosing a shutter speed half the duration of your frame rate. If you're shooting 1 picture every 4 seconds, choose a shutter speed of 2 seconds. Now you don't have to follow this to the T, but it always gives you a really good jumping off point to start with. Time lapses that go from day to night or vice versa are often called the Holy Grail, not only for their beauty, but because it's really difficult to capture them. There are several different techniques that you can employ to help you get this perfectly. Here are the 2 that we like to use most. Aperture priority mode on your camera allows you to set your lens's aperture, then let your camera automatically adjust its own shutter speed to maintain a constant level of aperture. The wider your aperture, the better, because a closed aperture will require very long exposure times for you to get enough light, and that could overlap your frame intervals. The ease of aperture priority mode does come with some drawbacks, mainly from the camera's inability to adjust itself perfectly. Minute changes in the frame's lighting can cause the camera to make drastic changes in exposure between frames. Also, the faster shutter speeds necessary to properly expose brighter portions of the time lapse could end up creating a choppy look in playback that has little to no motion blur. Our preferred method involves carefully changing the exposure manually during a setup, then using post software to smoothly ramp the exposure and remove any flicker. This method is more effective than aperture priority, but requires more attention, and this can be a little risky because you have to physically interact with the camera and you could bump your shot. Well, there you have it. We hope that this information helps you get on the road to shooting the perfect time lapse.